Okay, so Boker Tov, everyone. Bruchim Abayim. I'll just let you know in advance, so there's full disclosure here. I do record these sessions so they can be available afterwards. So just be aware of that in terms of what you say, etc. And hopefully nothing you say anyway are things that are regrettable. So we're going to look at Parshat Va'era, although today is Rosh Chodesh, and we might as well consider the Rosh Chodesh reading, but that happens regularly, and Va'era only happens once a year, so let's focus on that today. So there are a number of things that came to me as I was considering this week's Parsha. Let's take a look at a couple of the first verses and do a little bit of a textual study, and then maybe we'll get on to some other issues that at least I was inspired to consider as I read some of these verses. So I mentioned before that Va'era starts at chapter 6, verse 2. And you might say, well, why does it start on verse 2? Why not on verse 1? Well, there are all sorts of different reasons. First of all, in a nutshell, and I won't go into this right now, but the chapters were designated by medieval Christian theologians. The chapter designation is not really a Jewish designation. The Parshiot designations are certainly a Jewish designation based on our calendar, and that was done hundreds of years before the chapters were designated. But you might say, but why not include, why start the chapter a little bit earlier? So if you look at the last verse of Parshat Shemot from last week, verse 1 of chapter 6, it says, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Ata tireh asher aseh lefaro ki biyad chazaka yishalchem uviyad chazaka yirgashem me'artzo. So I can't say why they might have decided that was the place to start the chapter, but certainly the fact that remains in the previous Parsha and not this week's Parsha is wonderful dramatic effect. Because what does it do? It leaves you with a little bit of suspense. God finishes last week's Parsha by saying, okay, all this stuff hasn't gone well for you. You're complaining that the children of Israel, despite what you've said to them and what I've instructed you to do, things have only gotten worse for them. Now they have to collect their own straw, etc. But you know what? You're going to see in next week's Parsha, you're going to see what I'm going to do in order to start this process of getting the children of Israel out of Egypt. So it's a beautiful way to end the Parsha and then begin this week's with a message that Moses needs to bring to Pharaoh. So let's take a look at the first verse. By the way, do most of you have access to a Chumash or to the text of Sefaria?
Yeah.
If you open the link? Okay. So hopefully you all see the link in the chat box.
Michael, usually you put it up on the screen, the Sefaria.
I can do that. I prefer to see your faces, but I'm happy to look at the text as well for your benefit. So give me 1 second and I'll put it up on the screen for you. Just give me a thumbs up when you can see the text. Sometimes it takes a moment to show up on the screen.
There we go.
Okay, great. So if you look at the first verse, I find the first verse quite fascinating, actually. Because what does it say? It says, Vaidaber Elohim el Moshe, Vayomer elav ani Adonai. And then as we go through the text, you'll find, as we go through some of the other verses, Vayera el Avraham ushmi Adonai, and it's the name of Adonai that shows up from now on more or less in the text. And that's the name that God wants to be known as. However, when God addresses Moses here at the beginning of the Parsha, it's saying Elohim. Vaidaber Elohim el Moshe. It uses a different name of God. And some of the commentators ask, well, why doesn't it say Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe? That's what we often find in these introductory verses to speeches of God to Moses. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor. Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. So why here does it use a different name, especially when God wants to say that my name is Adonai, and I want everybody to know that. Apparently, not everybody understood that was God's name, and they may have referred to God by other things. So why do you think they would use, at least the text, the editor, whoever might have put this together, why would the introduction be with the name Elohim as opposed to Adonai? And I'll just add to that question before you consider a response. We often associate the name Elohim from what we call Midat Hadin, God as a judge, God as following rules of law, of judgment, that aspect of God as a judge, as opposed to Adonai, which we often associate with Midat HaRachamim, the God of mercy, demonstrations of compassion and mercy, which we often don't associate with a judge. Those are perhaps, we like to consider a judge emotionally detached from whatever rulings that she's about to determine and place. So we have these two aspects of God. We start off the Parsha with Midat Hadin, the God as judge, and then we immediately go to the name that God wants the children of Israel to know God as, Adonai, the God of compassion, the God of mercy. Any idea why we need these two names right at the beginning rather than just go with Adonai? Anyone want to take a stab at that? I can't see it all now with the screen, so if anybody has a hand up, just speak out and go ahead.
Michael, it's Larry.
Larry, go ahead. Okay.
Yeah. Elohim connotates strict justice. Mm-hmm. So I think what's happening here is the beginning of the Parsha. He's indicating that it's a much more severe connotation of the name, whereas the name Hashem, for example, is more of a God of mercy. It denotes his power and his power, but it also denotes his mercy. There's a number of other names that Hashem is referred to, El Shaddai, Adonai, but basically what I think we're doing here is starting off that he's strict justice. He's a judge, and it's a much more let us say tough connotation of the name.
Okay, fair enough. And there are Mefarshim, there are commentators, such as Rashi, who mentions the fact that why specifically here use Elohim? Because God is responding possibly to what Moses said before. Moses challenged a little bit God at the end of the previous parsha. He says, look, you asked me to come here, you gave me a task, I did what you told me, and things have only gotten worse. Why did you bother sending me? Things have only gotten more oppressive for the children of Israel since we began this process. Now they can't get the straw, they have to collect it themselves. The oppression is much more severe. So this challenge to God, perhaps, is a bit of a response, at least according to Rashi, using the name of judgment as opposed to Adonai, but then quickly goes to Adonai because Adonai is a name that was used in other chapters and other events and in the narrative of Genesis when God makes promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, of course, saying that eventually I'm going to bring you into a promised land. This land is going to be yours. Your people will be great. You'll multiply. You'll be like the sand, like the stars of the sky, etc. But that hasn't taken place yet. And God has not fulfilled that covenant yet, despite those promises. And so now this idea of God as the God of mercy and compassion, yes, now through this name of mercy and compassion, I'm going to do what I have promised to do. You are going to be the instrument of that. So it's important that you know my name, and it's important that the elders know my name. It's important, no less, that Pharaoh knows my name. And therefore, from now on, this is the name I want to be known by. The God that has the capacity, if we can use that term, to fulfill a covenant, to fulfill promises made with earlier generations, with individuals, and now with the nation. And so the fact that the children of Israel have earned this for various reasons, one because of the promises made before, one because of the oppression that they're suffering, and God is a God who helps people who are oppressed. And that's another theme that's fascinating in this week's Parsha. So the whole idea of the name of God is a wonderful discussion, and there are many other commentaries offered with regards to this, with regards to El Shaddai. I don't want to dwell on that more than we have at this point, but I just want you to be aware that sometimes we read through, and when we're reading the English, we say, God spoke to Moses, I am the Lord, and we don't differentiate El Shaddai. We hear these different names, and they have different connotations, they have different significance, and there's, I would not hesitate to say, a very careful choice made by the editor of the text here in deciding which name to use for God in which circumstances. And as I said, that's a fascinating study in itself when those names change. But just to be aware, at the beginning of this parsha, we already have 3 names in the first 2 verses: Elohim, Adonai, and El Shaddai. And all those connect with the appearance that God has had with earlier figures in the Genesis narrative, the patriarchs and matriarchs, and now with Moses and Aaron. And perhaps each of those encounters that humanity has with God have different elements, different aspects of that experience. And I think the Torah wants us to be aware of that. Every time there's an encounter with God, it's not always the same. It's not always the same God, perhaps, that we meet. We like to think of God as this entity of consistency, of omnipotence, etc. But that may be true, but human encounter with God is going to vary because humans are not that consistent. Humans are not omnipotent, omniscient. Humans change. Humans, every time they meet with God, there's going to be something different about that encounter. And I think perhaps that's something that we can be aware of if we haven't yet been here in the beginning of this Parsha. Okay, so that's one issue that kind of fascinated me as I went through the Parsha. The other one is something I kind of threw at you on Monday. Those of you who were at the service, I mentioned that we have, in this week's Parsha at the beginning, we have the famous 4 elements of redemption, the 4 terms of redemption, one after the other. Oops, what happened to my screen there? Can you still see the screen?
Blank.
Yes,
It's
blank.
blank. Something's happened. Let me just see if I can get that back. Sorry, give me one moment. Maybe a Wi-Fi connection thing. No, my apologies. Something has happened, so I'll try to get it back to you. But I'll read the text, and I'm sure you'll assume that I'm reading it more or less correctly. So we have these 4 terms that refer to redemption. I'll just read the Hebrew for you and exaggerate the 4 terms. לכן אמור לבני ישראל, אני אדוני, והוצאתי אתכם מתחת סבלות מצרים, והצלתי אתכם מעבודתם, וגאלתי אתכם בזרוע נטויה ובשבטים גדולים, ולקחתי אתכם לי לעם, והייתי לכם לאלוהים, וידעתם כי אני אדוני אלוהיכם, etc., etc. And then one more, a 5th one, and I'll come back to this in a moment, והבאתי אתכם. Okay. Let's assume you haven't got a clue what I just read in terms of the English translation. So I'll translate it, and I'll emphasize the terms used for these redemption. So the English goes as follows. We're in verse 6, if you happen to have the text in front of you. Say, therefore, to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. So just a moment to go back, we said that God has said to Moses, my name is Adonai. That's what I want you to go by from now on, or at least in the context of dealing with the children of Israel and Pharaoh. And so God makes it very clear. So say, therefore, to the Israelite people, I am the Lord. Make sure you're using that name. Why is it so important? Because the people of Israel, the children of Israel, they have to have a name. That's the way humans are. They can't go with this mysterious, ineffable, divine essence. They have to have a name. Give them a name. Adonai is the name I want them to know me by. And that's the name they're going to understand from now on. So that's the first thing you need to do. I am the Lord. Now, I will free you. That's the first term, the hotzeti. The next one, will deliver you from their bondage. Third one, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and through extraordinary chastisements. And the fourth one, and I will take you to be my people. And a verse later, I will bring you unto the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right. So I posed to those who were at the Minyan on Monday, does that order make sense? I'm going to translate it a little more literally. I think there's a bit of a paraphrase here with the translation here. So it says here, V'hotzeti etchem, I will take you out from under the oppression of Egypt. V'hitzalti etchem, I will save you from that bondage, from that hard work. V'ga'alti etchem bizron tetuya, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great signs. V'lakachti etchem li, and I will take you to me as a people, and I shall be to you as a God, and therefore you shall know that I am Adonai, the one who takes you out of Egypt. And then lastly, v'heveti etchem. So my question was, does that order make sense? I shall take you out from under the suffering that you're experiencing right now, and then I shall save you from the work. Well, does that make sense? Don't you need the first thing? How do you get people out from that situation, the circumstances of slavery? Don't you need to end the slavery first? Don't you need to stop the work? What's this idea about I will deliver you from their bondage, I will free you from the labors of the Egyptians and then deliver you from their bondage. So the idea of this order is something fascinating. I found an interesting interpretation by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg from Machon Hadar. You may have heard of Rabbi Greenberg. He's a wonderful commentator and a Jewish leader in study as well as social action. So he says this, to bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt. He goes through this idea of psychologically getting people out from the situation, which needs to be done in stages. It's not as if you take them out of slavery, put them in a place where they can control their own lives, and you're finished. It doesn't work like that. We know, as we have studied in the past, that the slave mentality is not something so easily rid of. It's something that takes a long time, and even removing the chains is something that perhaps needs to be done in a certain way. So Rabbi Greenberg says to bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt means to undermine the self-evident superiority of the master, which both the owner and the passive slave take as an unassailable given. When the authority of the master is broken, the slave begins to feel the injustice and wrongfulness of being enslaved. So what do they mean by bring you out from under the burdens of Egypt? He's trying to say that before you can do anything tangible, physical, you have to do something that convinces those slaves, those people who are being oppressed, that those who are oppressing them are not God, and that they are only human beings. And therefore, the slaves or anyone who's being oppressed should not feel that that situation can't change. The moment you give an oppressor and assume that that oppressor has absolute power, then you've given up perhaps on any hope that your situation can genuinely change. You see no way of removing that person and removing that your circumstances. But once you undermine the authority and what you have taken for granted as the superiority of the master, that's when things can start to change. And if I take a very perhaps odd example, it's not as if we felt that Donald Trump has a certain aura of superiority or anything like this. But I would say until the last couple of months, probably following the election, it hasn't become as self-evident to people, other than his supporters, of course, that there's something really, really wrong that can be changed. Until now, a lot of people have assumed there's nothing you can do about it. He's got that power with the social media. He's got access to money. He has these things that enable him to do the kind of things he wants, even with occasional criticism and condemnation, but keeps doing them. It's only once that element of legitimacy in his eyes and perhaps in the eyes of many has been completely undermined in the light of the events over the last month and a half and certainly over the last week, that people feel that things can change. Granted, there was an election and he was defeated by somebody else, but I think it's only the power and the sense of relief by the fact that he has now become undermined. He has undone himself with what he's done. Sometimes it's not something that we do, but something that tyrant does to themselves. So similarly here with, again, it's a bit of a stretch, I admit, but similarly with Pharaoh, until you undermine that superiority, meaning Pharaoh needs to know that I am God. Why is that so important? Because when Pharaoh realizes that I am God, Pharaoh realizes he is not God. He does not have that absolute authority over human lives as he thinks he does and as everybody assumes that he does. So this first idea of go out from under the burdens of Egypt means get out of this mentality that the person who is oppressing you has the absolute right, legitimacy, and authority to do that. They don't. They've assumed that unjustly, unrightly, and things can be done to change that. And that's why I'm here. And that's why I've sent Moses and Aaron and the elders of Israel to change that situation. But you got to believe that that situation can change because that person is not a legitimate ruler and has done things that are not appropriate in the eyes of God. And that is about to change. So that change in perhaps initial psychological comprehension and understanding of your circumstances is the first thing. If you don't get to that point, removing chains are not going to do it. That's not going to be sufficient. You have to start with some psychological process, in the words of Yitzhak Greenberg. Now, what's the next one? Save you from bondage. That means simply stopping that servile labor, meaning ending the slavery. And what does that mean? It means ending allowing others to tell you what to do and having authority of what you can do. It means not doing that work anymore and being able and seeing yourself as capable and empowered to choose what you want to do based on your own criteria, not on the criteria and apparently self-evident authority of somebody else who's imposed those tasks on you. That's a huge thing. So first you need to bring them out of this mentality that things can't change, as most of them would have thought as slaves, and as slaves have often thought, whether in the Roman Empire or in certainly more modern times. And then you need to do something tangible about it. You need to show them that you got to stop that slavery, and you got to enable them to be able to choose what they want to do. And it's probably no coincidence that slaves in the Confederacy, in the United States in general, and before the Civil War, and unfortunately until much more modern times, have used and identified so powerfully with the Exodus story, and possibly because of this process that they need to go through. This idea that regardless of the fact that they are being enslaved unjustly. It's not something that is unchangeable. They see themselves as children of God. The religious element is very powerful, and it's only for reasons that of abuse by those who happen to have authority at the moment, not God-given, that they're in the circumstances they are. But this element of hope that as the children of God, that God at some point is going to help redeem those slaves, that's something that perhaps has allowed blacks in their situation and circumstances in the United States for so many generations to maintain some kind of identity and hope that things will eventually change. But of course, then something tangible needs to happen. And the third stage, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. So true redemption will take place if you don't feel alone. It's wonderful to feel that you're a child of God and that God sometimes will do something, but you need to see that something has been done. So this idea that God says, I'll redeem you because I'll be extending my arm to you, meaning I'm going to be a partner in helping you achieve your independence, your liberation, your freedom, your new sense of empowered identity. So you need to feel that there's a partner out there. It's not just a one-time action, but this outstretched arm that is going to be there all the time. That's going to be there to bring you out of that situation, perhaps psychologically, tangibly, and continue that support. And then what's the last one? V'lakachti etchem, I shall take you as a people. meaning it's a continuation of this outstretched arm. I'm going to outstretch my arm, but that's only the first step. I'm going to take you as a people. You are now going to be my people. You're going to have that permanent sense of security that you belong to something, that you belong to God. And why is that very powerful? Because it kind of closes a circle of delegitimizing human authority over others, breaking the cycle of tangible slavery, reaching out to bring those people out and have them feel that they belong to something greater. But then, what does it mean that I'll make you a people and I'll make you my people and I will be your God? It means that it's not a freedom from doing things. It's not a freedom, what you might say, a carefree freedom, where I have no obligations. I've been freed from slavery. I can do what I want now. That's not freedom. Freedom is when you have the freedom to choose things and you're offered something that allows you to make commitments and feel responsibility by choice. And that's what this is about. When God says he's going to make us a people, I'm not going to free you, take you out in the desert or to take you to some desert island to a beautiful resort in Cancun and let you do whatever you want. That's not the Jewish idea of freedom and liberation. Freedom and liberation means freedom and liberation to choose something that demonstrates your identity as a child of God and your responsibility to work towards making God's world the kind of world it should be. That's what the freedom is. It's not freedom to do nothing. It's freedom to be part of something. And according to Rabbi Greenberg, the fifth element is no less important, because what does it say? After you have that sense and you now feel that you're part of a covenant with God, as God promised to the patriarchs and matriarchs, where can you do that? You can do that where you feel at home. The best place is to do that where you feel at home. And therefore, this idea of v'heveti etchem al haaretz, I'm going to take you to the land that I promised. After we've gone through this whole psychological and tangible redemption from slave mentality and slave action, the way to maintain that sense of covenant is to relate to all aspects of the covenant, which include being in a place where you can feel at home, where you can be your own people. Having said that, what does it mean to be our own people? Does it mean that all those who identify with us as Jews, as members of that sacred covenant with God, as laid out in Genesis with the patriarchs and matriarchs, and given very tangible and specific obligations through the rest of the Torah and all the commentary that comes later in terms of explaining those laws and customs, does that mean the people who identify are the people who will enjoy that sense of freedom and liberation? Or is it incumbent upon us to make sure that that sense of freedom and liberation is enjoyed by everybody who lives in that land? And when I was thinking of this and following, reading this commentary by Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, it got me thinking a little bit to what's going on in Israel right now. And what's going on in Israel, I listened to a webinar a couple days ago that talked about, of all things, how vaccines are being rolled out in Israel and how they're not, at the moment, being rolled out to the Palestinians. So why do I see this as relevant? Because when we consider our situation and our circumstances in Egypt, how we were denied rights, of course, you don't talk about human rights. It's a bit of an anachronism to talk about human rights in third millennia, 3,000 years ago, Egypt. That's a bit anachronistic. But nevertheless, whatever rights and privileges and responsibilities that ruling power had towards those who lived there, when we think of today what those responsibilities are, we have to ensure that if we're going to take the message of these 5 elements, certainly the first 4, and I would say the last one no less, of redemption and the ability to identify as a people with rights, with freedom, liberated, with responsibilities and obligations of their own choosing, then we have to realize and execute that responsibility when we are the power, when we are the authority. And so the discussion in this webinar that I attended said, well, why is it that Israel is not rolling out vaccinations to the Palestinians? So there was a lot of talk from different experts that were brought in there about the fact, well, this side claims this side claims this. Israel, before an election, doesn't want to be shown to giving vaccines to Palestinians when it should be vaccinating all the Israelis who live within Israel. Palestinians say, well, we don't want help from Israel. That's not our interest, but we want to be able to have the right to access vaccines from other sources. So it's not all clear exactly what's happening, but what is clear is that the Palestinians don't have vaccines. And so they are now suffering from the spread of that disease to an extent that is a threat to their population. But even in a practical Machiavellian outlook, Palestinians come and work in Israel. So, and there's contact between Palestinians and Israelis, regardless of what you think about closed and sealed borders between Gaza and Israel and the West Bank and Israel. That's a fiction. People cross the border all the time, whether legally or illegally. And so there's contact. So even from a self-centered survival point of view, it makes sense for Israel to make sure that the Palestinians are vaccinated. So I don't have the opportunity now to get into all the details, but when we think about what the obligation is, even if we look at, and they brought a lawyer there who deals with these issues, they brought a lawyer that when somebody is occupying in no subjective evaluation, occupying as being the person who has authority over a piece of land. When you are in that position, it's your obligation to maintain and provide health services for all those people there. Whether you provide them yourself or whether you allow others to come in, such as UN forces or others, that's fine, but you got to provide those health services. Part of the health services is vaccination. So there's an obligation by Israel to make sure that people are vaccinated. Again, certainly for moral and ethical reasons, as the responsibility is incumbent upon somebody who is in control of a land where others live. And also from a self-centered point of view, for our own sake, it makes sense to make sure that the Palestinians are vaccinated. But this brings me to another issue, and also in Israel, not just in Israel, but in Canada. Where do, in the list of prioritization, where do prisoners fall? Should prisoners have the same rights as anyone else? Should the same criteria be used to roll out vaccinations to prisoners? So I can tell you that the interior minister in Israel had claimed that they are not a priority. The priority in terms of people in prisons would be the prison guards and then the prisoners. And don't think that that's not any different in Canada. In Canada, it may be a little softer, but there were members of one of the parties who suggested that until all health workers and all frontline workers and all those in long-term care facilities, and any of you who have people in long-term care facilities know the importance of getting those people vaccinated. Until all those are not vaccinated, we're not giving any vaccinations to prisoners. And yet, let's start with the moral and ethical obligation. Similar to people who are under our authority in territories or lands that we have governorship of, similar to the Palestinians, prisons are a similar case. We have authority over those people. They don't have the full rights and the power to maintain the type of health conditions and sanitary conditions that will enable them to stay virus-free. So it's our responsibility, because we have authority over those people, to make sure that they are provided with health services. That's the moral and ethical one. But again, from a self-centered, we have guards going into those prisons in and out every day. They don't live there with the prisoners. And so from the standpoint of a practical element, those guards are subject to the contagion of the virus by virtue of their being there. And they have contact with the population outside the prison as well. So even from a practical standpoint, it makes sense for us to make sure that not only the guards, not only the people who work in the prisons, but the prisoners themselves. And of course, anyone who knows, who's visited a prison, no matter what you may think of prisons, as sometimes they're shown on television as nice, clean places, often not, certainly in recent years. those places are perfect opportunity for a virus to spread. The crowding, the sanitation conditions, no matter what we would like to think, even in a developed and progressive country like Canada, a prison is not a place where you want to be, where there's a virus that is accessible. And so it's our responsibility wherever, as custodians of prisons, as custodians of lands where people are under our authority, it's our responsibility to make sure that health services are provided for them. And I'll throw in one more element, and this might be a little bit of a political element, but this is said in as legalese as possible. So you might say that the people who live within Israel in the Green Line, those should be the priority for getting the vaccine. And those who live in the territories, because the Judea and Samaria, as Gaza, however you want to refer to them, I'm not going to choose a term that fits anyone's political agenda, but however you refer to those lands, you might say the Palestinians shouldn't get it because they don't live in an area that's part of Israel. Okay. What about the settlers? The settlers who live in those territories, they are under pretty much the same administration in terms of the military authority that lives there. They have their own civilian governing tools and instruments as well, but they're within an area that has an overall authority that should be equal for everyone. And therefore, if you're going to give health services to some of those who live in those territories, but not to all, that is seen and can easily be seen, as this lawyer contended on the webinar I attended, as discrimination. He hesitated to use, it was interesting, he hesitated to use a certain word, which corresponds to a situation in another country not too many decades ago, but very quickly in the chat box, people were throwing out the word apartheid. And so this idea that to allow services to be provided, and again, this is only one example. Of course, the roads, the infrastructure services and other services provided to the Israeli Jewish settlers who live in those lands is much different than those services provided to the Palestinians. So this is only another example. And I bring this up because when we talk about liberation and redemption, I said to you, the fourth one that talks about God taking us to be a people and God being a God to us as a people. The essence of that is that we don't have carefree, untied, disconnected freedom. That means nothing. We have a freedom that allows us and perhaps demands of us to be responsible for ourselves, for our relationship with God, if that's part of your Weltanschauung, or certainly to be responsible in our relationships with other human beings who live in our community, who live in our nation, who live among us. And that responsibility means that we have to make sure that they feel and enjoy the same type of liberation and freedom and responsibility, don't get me wrong, that's incumbent upon everyone, that we have. So if we're going to take the experience and the message of the Exodus seriously, we have to make sure that when we look at ourselves and look at others, because we can't help but look at others, that's our nature. We always see ourselves and we see others. When we look at others, we have to make sure that they have the same privileges of freedom, liberation, and independence that we have. And it means, on a very contemporary, relevant issue, it means to make sure that the health services and vaccines are available to everyone who lives among us. We can take a message to the world and make sure that we're getting vaccines to every country in the world, and that's hopefully something Canada will be doing as well. But certainly within Canada's borders and within Israel's borders, however you define them, everyone in there has to have access to those vaccines on some kind of fair, equal basis, as challenging as that may be politically, as challenging as that may be economically. We have to make sure that when we decide on criteria, and if you check with health authorities in Canada and health authorities in Israel, who would, I would say, have a more objective view of how to prioritize vaccination rollout, they've all said prisoners need to be given those vaccines as much. They are at risk, if not more at risk than any other population, certainly at least at risk as some of the patients in long-term care facilities and frontline workers. So as part of that prioritization, they need to be given those vaccines. And unfortunately, there are enough elements in any society, whether it be Canada or Israel, who see others before they see the idea of freedom, liberation, and independence for all. So I'm giving you a little bit of work to think about how we in Canada and how Israel is dealing with some of these issues, but they're very much tied in with our responsibilities, having been redeemed and taken out of Egypt for a higher purpose. Not taken out, but taken to something. So I'll give anyone an opportunity who would like to comment or ask any questions. Feel free to do so. I know I lay it on pretty heavy every week. I realize that, but hey, you didn't come here just to drink your coffee. I know that.
Michael, is Israel vaccinating non-Jewish Israelis in Israel?
Yes.
They are. Because I read a news item that said that they were not, it was sort of a brackets, not Arabs. And I didn't think that sounded right.
No, I heard, and again, because I don't have access or I'm not privy to all the details and information that some official sources were, but one of the representatives of one of the organizations that deals with these issues in trying to make sure that that happens, he said quite clearly that non-Jewish Israelis, whether they be Christian, Muslim, Druze, or Bedouin in Israel, they have access to the vaccines as everyone else does. Some of the problem there is because of the inferior infrastructure and services that are endemic, unfortunately, to Israel. So the rollout may be a touch slower, but the implementation is there and they are getting access to those. So I would say yes, based on what I heard from this person who works with an organization that deals just exactly with these issues of fair access to services. So yes, nothing like what's going on with the Palestinians, where there's very little contact or cooperation, or let's put it this way, at least insufficient to make sure that they're having some kind of better access to the vaccine.
Thank you, and I agree with you.
All right, well, if I've got you in a point where you're not even able to ask questions, that's good, that's good. It means you're thinking about something. And I hope that, as with a lot of the stuff that's going on, that you have the opportunity to speak with your friends, whether it's Zoom or in other ways, with your children and with your grandchildren about these issues, because it's one thing for them to think that, well, vaccines are being rolled out, it's all great, things will get better eventually, but how is that going on? On what basis do we decide who gets them? And we talked about this a few months ago when before the vaccines were available. We were saying the issue of prioritization is going to be a huge one. The technical aspect of rollout, again, in Canada, we're not doing anywhere near as well as we should be, or at least as we expect. But there is a process of prioritization. But even with all the planning, with all the anticipation of getting those vaccines, that discussion and arguments and disagreements about how to roll it out and to whom to roll it out first, that's still going on. We had all the time in the world to plan and think about those things and come up with some kind of fair understanding, maybe not consensus, but perhaps with an overwhelming idea of how that should happen. And yet, that's not what's going on now. There's still disagreement. As I said, Israel and Canada, I only mention those two because maybe those are closest to heart. You hear enough about what's going on in the States, but I can only imagine what's going on in other countries. I would hate to say or imagine, I just don't have the information, what's going on in countries where the racism has been quite blatant in recent years, whether it's to immigrants from North Africa or wherever. I imagine they're having at least as much trouble and probably much worse than the kinds of things that I've described in Canada and Israel. But, that might be something you can research as well and share with us next time we meet. So I wish everyone a wonderful day. wonderful, not necessarily on the basis of the mood you're leaving right now, but wonderful in the sense that hopefully you've been challenged, and if anything, at least seek to explore, find out what's going on. Don't assume that everything's going as smoothly as you might like to believe. Find out what's going on with vaccination rollout, and that's only one issue, in Canada, in Israel, and in other places around the world. And share that information with others. There needs to be more open and fully disclosed discussion about these issues, and not just let them be left in the hands of authorities.
I'm thinking of the homeless population, Michael.
By all means, and I didn't neglect them, but that's something that is at least as problematic as anything else. And certainly we have at least as much responsibility towards the homeless as to prisoners and to immigrants and to those who may not be citizens, whatever. But we have to make sure. And there was just a study that came out, I heard 2 days ago. Homeless people are 5 times more likely to contract COVID than the rest of the population. 5 times more likely. So they are one of the highest at-risk populations. They need to be vaccinated. Even though we're not walking around, you walk around the street. Again, forget the ethical and moral. Think about the practical. You walk by homeless people, and I hope you respond in a more welcoming manner than most of us do. But for your own safety, for your own best interests, those people need to be vaccinated.
And in my neighborhood, I'll say quickly, I know you're leaving. In my neighborhood, at the time the crisis hit, they housed a whole bunch of homeless people in a hotel, and it's a very nice neighborhood. It's an affluent neighborhood, and the people in the neighborhood were protesting daily. They were angry that these people were housed, and they were saying we didn't even get notice. Give me a break. What notice are you going to get in a time of crisis? Like, they needed to be picked off the street and housed. It really was a fiasco. I was astounded by the lack of humanity. It's really sad.
And unfortunately, that happens not just with the homeless, it happens with youth at risk when they try to create shelters, or people who come from abusive home environments, and they try to create a shelter in a neighborhood where they say, well, we don't want that population here. We don't want people who are abusing them coming around looking for them once they find out where this place is. So there are a lot of examples of our lack of concern for the Ani, Evion, Almana, the poor. The Torah instructs us to take care of those who don't have the resources and don't have the empowerment that we have. It's our responsibility, whether it's health services or even a home, and of course other elements of their existence. We don't often take that responsibility as seriously as we should. So thank you for bringing that up, Ruth. All right, everyone, stay safe, stay engaged, and stay communicating in whatever way you do that. And we have a bar mitzvah next week, so I won't have a chance to meet with you next week, but we'll certainly meet again in 2 weeks. Hopefully, whoever is available, make yourselves available. Chodesh Tov. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Have a great day, everybody.
Michael, I ordered 6 sets. They